Joining me now from the Institute of Public Affairs, Simon Breheny in Melbourne. And here with me in the studio from the McKell Institute is Pat Garcia. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining me. Now, Simon, first to you. This is being framed, and certainly Bill Shorten, the Greens, are unforgiving if Tony Abbott goes through with this. Will it be a broken promise, the debt tax?
Absolutely. I think this decision of the government is one of the worst that they have made. Increasing tax on Australians is not what we need right now. Australia doesn't have a revenue problem. It's not even quite fair to say that we've got a spending problem. What we do have is we have a size of government problem. The Australian government currently does far too much. It tries to involve itself in areas of the economy which it shouldn't be involved in. In a few years' time, we're going to see the government be responsible for over 25% of the economy, 26.5% of the economy in 2 years' time. Abbott's rhetoric before the election was far better. Before the election, at rallies around the country, these were being handed around to the party faithful. These were the sorts of things that were being talked about by the Abbott government. Lower taxes. And extraordinarily now, we have a government that's looking at increasing taxes after saying on the 25th of August in 2013, at the official campaign launch of the Liberal Party's federal election campaign, Tony Abbott said, "We understand that government doesn't create wealth, people do, and that no country has ever taxed its way to prosperity." I'm wondering now where the Tony Abbott is of the 25th of August 2013. Australia needs that Tony Abbott. It doesn't need the Tony Abbott of tax increases.
Simon Breheny, you've come very well prepared, and I feel that we might get some furious agreement from you, Pat Garcia. Now, if he did go ahead with this debt tax, would it be a Julia Gillard-esque carbon tax moment, do you think?
I think it would be. I think everyone's questioning his honesty at the moment. I mean, when he was in opposition, he quite clearly said, you can't tax your way to prosperity. Now, I both furiously agree with Simon and disagree to an extent. I think there is a revenue problem with the government budget. In the Howard years, government revenue amount to about 25% of GDP. Today, in the Abbott years, it amounts to about 23% of GDP. Now, that's a fall of 2% of GDP, which doesn't seem like much, but that amounts to about a $30 billion gap per annum in government revenue. Now, you need to address that. Now, the government's been speaking about government expenditure for the last few months.
Yeah, it is. It's easy to sit here and pontificate about what the government shouldn't do, but what should it do? What do you think there are the top three things the government should do?
Well, it needs to improve economic activity, and I think Simon and I would agree on that. It needs to invest in education, it needs to invest in innovation, it needs to invest in infrastructure. It needs to do what it can.
But what about those more short-term measures that we hear from Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey constantly, that this is going to be a painful budget? They need to cut in some areas. What are those areas that are worth cutting? We've now heard last night that the pension is ruled out for now.
Well, it needs to do two things. It does need to increase revenue, but it doesn't need to increase income tax. If you increase income tax, you reduce discretionary consumer spending, you reduce economic activity, you reduce company profits, you reduce household income, and eventually you reduce government revenue. The other thing is the opposition and the government disagree on the types of expenditure that you should cut. Now, the government wants to invest in a $5.5 billion parental paid leave scheme that provides $75,000 to millionaires to take 6 months leave.
We will get to the paid parental leave scheme.
So you don't want to do that. You don't want to spend $2.5 billion on a direct action plan that doesn't, reduce emissions. You don't want to cut pensions. You don't want to introduce co-payments for GPs. You don't want to do those sort of things. That hurts people.
All right, we will get to the paid parental leave scheme, but Simon Breheny, I'll just get your response quickly to that. As I said, we can sit here and talk about what the government shouldn't do, but what should it do?
Well, clearly one of the things that it needs to do is it needs to drop its very serious, significant spending commitments. So one of the things that the Abbott government is talking about doing, as has been mentioned, is introducing this $5.5 billion per year paid parental leave scheme. That needs to be dropped. The $500 million being spent on direct action, and that's a conservative estimate, that needs to be dropped. There's $1 billion going to a state-sponsored media organisation that competes with private media organisations in the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. That $1 billion needs to go. There are billions and billions of dollars that can be saved by making cuts, and those cuts need to be made in this budget. It's so important that the government gets it right in this budget. This is their first budget, and it's going to be much more difficult when we're looking at a time that's closer to the election. Now is the time that they need to make the very difficult decisions, and the Abbott government was elected to make those difficult decisions. So it's so important that they make those decisions now.
Okay,
but
Simon Breheny.
One of the things that's really important is that they do this so that we do grow the economy. Cuts aren't a way of solving a budgetary problem. They're actually a way of growing the economy and making sure that the government takes less of our money and distributes it around the economy. A far better way of doing this is to have private individuals risking their own capital and creating entrepreneurial, innovative companies of their own.
Now, Pat Garcia, last night we saw this set-piece key address from Tony Abbott. The pension and not going ahead with that until a mandate is sought was probably the key message, but there was a lot in there about some immediate cuts that could be made, middle-class welfare in particular. Is this the right course of action to go down, and is it a fair area to target, given the tightening and the savings that could be made?
What the government is proposing at the moment is a mishmash of lots of different proposals, and a lot of it doesn't make sense, and it's not very coherent. What they're saying is we should cut pensions, but at the same time they're saying, but millionaires that are North Shore mums that are millionaires and who fall pregnant should get $75,000 for 6 months leave. None of it really is coherent, none of it really makes sense. In Tony Abbott's speech last night, he evoked the imagery of JFK when he said, you know, we're all in this together, and of course JFK said, you know, ask not what your country can do for you. It was stunning for a progressive to see a conservative politician evoke the imagery of a progressive leader as a justification for increasing taxes. That was just fascinating. I don't think it went down very well.
Simon Breheny, it does appear a bit of a mishmash at the moment, and I will get on to what is your favourite topic, the paid parental leave scheme. Now, again, Tony Abbott is standing by this morning. He says he's come around. He didn't always think this way. There's been a bit of a journey for him. Do you think, or how many MPs do you think have gone on that journey with Tony Abbott, or do you believe that MPs will cross the floor on this?
I think very few coalition MPs are with Tony Abbott on this. He's taken a significant political risk internally in following up with this paid parental leave scheme, particularly when the budget is in such bad shape. There's a huge amount of resentment around this, I think, and it'll be very, very difficult for him to push this through. It seems at the moment as though in the Senate there will be a number of senators that will simply cross the floor to ensure that this doesn't get through.
Would you be satisfied if this was tinkered with, if the threshold was at $100,000? Sue Boyce has flagged this today.
Absolutely not. I think these sorts of negotiations are negotiations that should go on between employers and employees. There are companies currently that provide for paid parental leave schemes, and there's no reason why that shouldn't continue. The problem, of course, will be if the government's paying for it, then no longer will you get private businesses deciding to pay for those sorts of schemes. I think just as companies compete based on salary and conditions, they should compete based on whether or not they've got paid parental leave schemes and whether or not their employees are interested in that sort of arrangement.
Pat Garcia, we've seen Tony Abbott try to differentiate here, saying it's a workplace entitlement, it's not welfare. Does that cut it?
No, I don't think it does. I think he's fighting a losing battle on this.
What about if it was redesigned, 100,000?
Listen, I think I agree with a paid parental leave scheme. I do. I think mothers who go on maternity leave deserve to be remunerated for that and the opportunities missed. But at the same time, I think this is overly generous. I think this is a very expensive scheme at a time when his narrative is we're in a budgetary crisis. Everyone needs to tighten their belts, and yet he's spending $5.5 billion on a new program. It doesn't make any sense.
One thing that was interesting, I thought, today in this 3AW interview was this from Tony Abbott.
Politicians feel the pain.
They sure will.
How?
Well,
watch this space, Neil.
Now, that smile might be a bit unnerving for some of Tony Abbott's colleagues. Simon Breheny, what do you think he's getting at there? What does he have in store for his own colleagues?
Look, it's very difficult to speculate, but I think the point to make here is that politicians make up a pretty small proportion of the population. It might be quite popular to go after politicians' salaries, and there are, in many cases, pretty valuable perks that they get on the job. They're very generous.
OK, Pat Garcia,
but
quick
I think there are
response
much
from you.
broader problems here.
Their salary package is, what, under $200,000 a year. How much money can they actually raise from them? I don't think much.
Yeah. Pat Garcia, Simon Breheny, thanks so much for joining me on Lunchtime Agenda today. And that is it for today's program.